right. So today I'll begin with an introduction and I'll outline for you guys kind of what the purpose and summary is of the Wildfire Safety Division data reporting standards. And then we'll get into some specifics about the reporting standards themselves. We'll talk about how we categorize data, our approach to our data schema, and we will conclude with a discussion on some open issues that we would like to solicit stakeholder comment and feedback on, as well as outlining some next steps in how we'll be moving forward with this. So with that, I'll give you a brief introduction. As many of you are likely aware, in a couple months ago, the Wildfire Safety Division published its broader strategic plan. And as part of that strategic plan, there was also the data strategy outlined in that plan. And the data strategy really is a gradual process. It's not going to be something that's overnight. There is a lot of tedious work that needs to be done to make sure we establish the frameworks and the consistency properly to be able to move forward. And the ideal data strategy we want to implement has a flow, as you see on this slide deck here, which is we want to standardize our data submissions and schedules so that we can properly record data that is consistent and comparable, and then graduate from there to doing retrospective analysis where we're looking at data of things that occurred and understanding and analyzing utility wildfire risk and how that changes. And then from there, as we develop and our capabilities and resources, moving towards a place where we can potentially in the future be able to do predictive analytics and project how things may change and get out ahead of issues as opposed to being more responsive. So with that outline and framework, I'd like to talk specifically about kind of where the Wildfire Safety Division is in our data strategy and implementation, what our purpose was. So first off, the wildfire mitigation plans in 2020 were really the first time that the division and the commission, as I understand it, had really large spatial data submissions. We received a high volume of data and information. However, what was realized as part of that process was due to inconsistencies in formatting, due to missing metadata, the data itself was very difficult to actually leverage and utilize in the short time period allotted for wildfire mitigation plan reviews. So as a result of that, several things were done. One is the division decided we needed to get out ahead of the data submissions and structure and standardize data as it should be reported to the division. And this effort was alluded to in the guidance resolution WSD 002 as condition guidance 10. And that was that we will be issuing a schema and data reporting standards for future utility data submission. Now, all of this also comes into play at a time when the commission as an agency is really reassessing and reevaluating how we utilize and leverage data and resources. So one exciting development that we have going on is the agency is implementing an enterprise ArcGIS system to manage our spatial data. Wildfire Safety Division has been leading this effort and building out our Wildfire Safety Division space, but this is a much bigger collaborative effort with the broader commission as a whole to help modernize and push our data capabilities to the next level. And one other thing that I did want to mention was we had quite a bit of partnership with our sister state agencies. I want to give a particular shout out to CAL FIRE, who we worked with very closely in developing these standards. But in addition to CAL FIRE, we solicited and had discussions with a variety of state agencies, the Natural Resources Agency, OES, the Air Resources Board, and many others. And the last thing I want to indicate is a very early draft version of these data standards were shared with utilities and discussed back in July as we were trying to assess and refine the feasibility and structure of how our data standards were organized. So what are the goals and expectations? One is, obviously, we want to standardize data. We want data to be consistent and comparable. The other thing we want to be able to do is schedule data updates so as to tie to our WMP annual update process. And so the hope, and we had some questions yesterday about the supplemental data request and if that was still going to be required. Ideally, we want to be able to form and structure our data reporting standards so that they're coming in consistently and frequently enough so that they may replace some of these other efforts like the supplemental data request. The other aspect to point out here is, like I mentioned, the Commission as an agency is really revamping and reshaping how its approach to data. And as part of that process, we understand that we need to be able to crawl before we walk and before we sprint. And we're at the very early stages of implementation of this strategy. We've made a lot of progress in a very short period of time. But I do want to reiterate to folks that this is a continually developing process. We will continue to refine and phase our approach to the implementation and update of our data standards as we gain more resources, as we gain more knowledge, and more capability. So with that, and I'll discuss this a little bit later today, we are taking a phased approach to rolling out implementation of our data reporting standards. And the last thing I wanted to mention in regards to this is we really do fully expect to not only fit in with the existing reporting structures and how data is currently reported, but we are expecting to push the boundaries of existing data collection and reporting to hopefully refine and provide better and more consistent data across the board. So with that, I want to break out into outlining for you guys two things. One is the various data categories and how we really structured our data schemas. And then I'll discuss kind of the approach to the schema, how to read the schema documents, and how to make heads or tails of those. So first and foremost, our data categories. As you can see here, we've broken out data categories into several buckets. One is asset data, which is broken out into points and lines. Asset line data is your power lines, for the essentially, and your points are everything else essentially that's considered an asset. However, in addition to that, we have also created data categories for PSPS events. These include all data related to the actual event itself, as well as schemas we've put together for collecting and reporting damage data, that's sustained during a PSPS event to the utility infrastructure, which we believe is an important indicator for future analysis. Next, and I know we had a lot of discussion yesterday regarding the term near miss. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is we have a data category that we call risk events. And the risk events really outline all the different types of events that the Wildfire Safety Division believes, one, we have currently available, and two, that would inform utility wildfire risk. And these include things such as ignition data, which has been reported since, I believe, 2014. Outage data, which, and I'll get into some of these in a little later, and then the various subsets of outage data, including vegetation-caused outages, as well as wire-down events. The next data category that we are tracking is initiative data. And when we say initiative data, what we're essentially talking about, for the most part, are two categories of data: vegetation inspections and projects, and then asset inspections and projects. And I'll break out and we'll discuss those in a little bit more of a deep dive later. And then the last bucket of data categories is what we call other data. And essentially, this is a catch-all to include any other data that we believe is relevant but may not fit cleanly into one of those other previous categories. These include things like critical facility information, weather information such as red flag warnings, administrative areas and how the utilities break down their service territories both for operational and also administrative purposes. And here is a snapshot of what the schema tables that were and the standards that were published last week look like. And the basic way to read these are, and this is a snapshot of our risk event wire down, what we call feature class, and a feature class is essentially the spatial data. So you have a structured table, and these are consistent. You'll see them throughout the document. You have a field name, which identifies essentially the name of the particular data that we'll be tracking, a description of what that data means, and then the type of field that it is. Is it text? Is it a date? Is it a number? And so this is the basic structure. And then from there, the next thing you want to look at is we have a number of what we call related tables. So related tables essentially connect additional information that might not be spatial to the feature class, which is the spatial data. Once again, this is a snapshot of our risk event wire down related table schema. And as you can see, as pointed out here in this slide, you have a wire down ID, which connects the wire to the wire down feature class table. From there, what I wanted to point out is, as we mentioned, there are a number of ID fields that you'll see throughout the schemas. And the ID fields are really intended to be able to tie together different databases and different information for comparison purposes. What you're looking at here in this diagram is referred to as an entity relationship diagram, or ERD, if you hear me reference that later in the presentation. And the ERD essentially shows us how are all these different data related. What aspects of one data set relate to something else in a different data set. And it is our overall kind of view of the structure of the data. So with that understanding of how the schemas are structured, I would like to do a deep dive onto a few of those data categories that we had selected and highlight for you guys some important and relevant information. So first and foremost, our risk event schemas. So here you're looking at an ERD for ignitions as well as outages and wire downs. So the ignition data, for those of you who have been tracking on commission proceedings pertaining to utility wildfire, will be familiar with. This is data that dates back to a 2014 decision, which required certain utilities to report data as it pertains to ignition stemming from utility infrastructure. We've taken that existing structure and leveraged everything in there. However, we have built upon that to progress and provide some additional information, which I'll cover a little later. In addition to that, and this is where I want to spend a little bit of time, when we talked yesterday about near misses, for us in the Wildfire Safety Division, and especially what we leveraged for the 2020 Wildfire Mitigation Plan, we really wanted to start with from a place where we knew there was an existing and rich data set. And that, for us, the starting place was outage data. And outage data, we believe, and its permutations are potential harbingers for ignition risk. And to that end, we've also have a specific schema particular to outages that are caused by vegetation. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but we do want to start digging into specific elements of risk drivers and how to better track and analyze the data around those. And then in addition to outages and vegetation-caused outages, we also have the wire down data, and a number of utilities already collect data as it pertains to an event that results in a wire coming down. And so we want to build and leverage that and continue to hopefully, excuse me, standardize that to the extent that we can. So what does the risk event schema look like? You have a number of ID codes, typically you'll see at the top. You'll have date and information there, and then you'll have a bunch of details pertaining to that risk event. What are the causes, and so on and so forth. So one thing, and this is a lot of information at this slide, I'm not going to read all this stuff out to you, but I do want to highlight several things. One important step that we took was we had existing ignition data schema based on a schema that was developed for reporting back in 2014. Those ignition data have certain suspected initiating event or cause categories that are structured in a particular way. One of the things that we strive to do with this data schema was align our cause categories to facilitate the ability to do better comparison in the future. So what you'll see throughout is we have primary and supplementary cause categories that are aligned across the different risk events, whether they're ignitions, outages, wire down events, so that we can facilitate better comparison. So what are some of the things that we added, and I would like to point out with ignition data, that weren't in the existing reporting standard requirement? One is because the CPUC high fire threat district map did not exist back when the initial ignition reporting requirements were made, we added that information. We add information particular to outage IDs if there was an outage, so we can tie back to the outage database. We asked for photographs, which is new. We had never asked for that before. We asked for the fire detection method and how, these various technologies that are being implemented, are they catching more of these fires than typical? Weather information. We had a big build out of weather information. We are tracking data around the nearest weather station so we can go and track the pertinent weather conditions at the time. But we're also tracking other things like the status of red flag warnings or fire weather watches or high wind warnings. We're also wanting to collect information around the fuel beds and where these ignitions are happening. And lastly, something that's also new is investigation status. We understand that a number of these investigations are often open, and because they're open investigations, typically or sometimes the reporting is not done until the investigation is closed, and we're trying to move forward or away from having that lag by allowing an indication of whether or not something is subject to an open investigation. And then aside from that, talking about outages, we're collecting a lot of useful information specific to, for example, the specific assets that were involved, the device that isolated the outage, all the cause details that I mentioned that we're trying to align with the ignition cause details, details around whether or not an expulsion fuse operated. And one of the other things that we've done is we've grouped and separated outage and related data between transmission and distribution, because our understanding, based on discussions we've had with the utilities, is that they all treat the data slightly differently when it comes to transmission and distribution. From there, an important aspect of data for us to track were issues around veg cause, both ignitions and outages. Veg cause ignitions, looking at the existing ignition data that we have, represents the single most causes as an individual driver. So to that end, we felt that it was very important to be able to pare down and zero in on more specific issues around what causes these vegetation contacts. So in addition to the existing ignition data, we have this veg cause outage data schema, which we're requiring or requesting that utilities start tracking additional information as it pertains to tree species, height, size, including its diameter at breast height, distance from the power lines, so that we can start developing a much more sophisticated understanding of both what drives vegetation-caused outages and ignitions, as well as to help better inform our assessments of utility vegetation management programs. And all of these are connected, as I mentioned earlier, through various ID fields. So, for example, an outage ID would track a vegetation to a specific outage, a vegetation-caused outage to a specific outage database that we could glean additional information from. And then finally, our wire down events include requirements for a lot of interesting detail pertaining to the actual conductors involved. And so that would include span length, the number of splices in that span, the material size and rating of the conductors, whether or not the wire down was energized, whether or not the wire down resulted in an ignition or an outage, its high fire threat district location. And the hope is that having a better understanding of these, more granular understanding, will help us better understand and then in the future prevent these types of ignition. Moving on, another important aspect or data category for us is initiative. Here's a snapshot of the initiative ERD. And as I mentioned earlier, initiatives are really broken down into 4 aspects. You have vegetation projects and inspections, and then you have asset inspections, as well as your grid hardening projects, which are your asset replacements or construction projects. So similar to how the previous schema table we looked at is structured, you once again have a number of ID fields that show and tie various initiative data to other databases. You have date and other pertinent information about the work performed, and then you have the specific information about the inspection, what type, whether there were any findings, the method of inspection. And this is, I'll reiterate, just a snapshot. This is not the total schema. And so I would really encourage people to browse through and read through the broader document that was shared last week ahead of this workshop. So with that, let's talk about some of the noteworthy attributes in our initiative schemas. So the initiative schemas are really developed to be able for us to in a much more standardized fashion, start assessing and evaluating information pertaining to utility projects as they're laid out in the Wildfire Mitigation Plan. So one thing that I should probably caveat all this by saying is a lot of the work that we're doing, while much of it could be used more broadly outside the scope of the Wildfire Safety Division purview, everything we've done has been developed with a specific purpose and intent for the division's use in evaluating and stakeholders' use in evaluating utility wildfire mitigation plans on an ongoing basis. So what do we learn by going through this process of trying to develop our initiative schemas? One thing that was abundantly clear, I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of outreach with sister agencies and different stakeholders. There is extremely broad interest, stakeholder interest, in collecting better and more standardized information around utility vegetation management projects. These cut across a number of different agencies' oversight, and we're working, and we believe that what we've put together is an initial step to help get us to a much better place. And one other thing that I'd like to point out, particular to the vegetation data, is because all the utilities have really different business processes around how they conduct and collect information around their various initiatives, we've opened the initiative data categories into different types of data. So we have vegetation data that's reported as polygon data, as line data, and point data, so that it aligns, or it can be aligned, with the differing utility practices and how they currently go about executing those projects as well as collecting that data. So specifically, what type of stuff are we looking at? When we talk about vegetation initiatives, We are looking at inspection and project types, technologies used, treatment types, very specific details about the trees, number of trees being worked, height, species, growth rate, tree IDs. Certain utilities have gone down the path of actually assigning specific ID numbers to individual trees. And we believe that that is a good practice to the extent that it is feasible, and we want to be able to facilitate collection and sharing of that type of information. We've also moved along the lines of trying to get more standardized polygon boundaries around things like parcels, land designations, permit status, things that are really relevant to some of our sister agencies, which we'll be continuing to refine and develop as we move forward. And then as it pertains to asset inspections and projects, it has a very similar structure. However, the data that we're collecting is very specifically tailored to asset inspections or grid hardening projects. So, for example, instead of tracking a tree ID, we would be tracking an asset ID. Instead of looking at an inspection type that is a clearance inspection or a hazard tree inspection, we're looking at inspection types that are patrol inspections or detailed inspections. And the other important element that I'd like to point out, and this was discussed by someone on the panel yesterday, which indicated that, well, if these programs are changing, that in the updates, the utility should provide information around how the programs are changing. Well, we've tried to key this into our existing schema for grid hardening projects, and that is being done through the change order process, which was scoped out in the guidance resolution WSB 002. And so we have specific data fields that require utilities, when they're submitting their quarterly reports on initiative data, especially grid hardening initiatives, for them to indicate what is the change order status, what type of change order it is, when was it issued, so on and so forth, to provide more detailed and structured information, and to also alert and highlight to stakeholders and the Wildfire Safety Division when things are changing and where they're changing. So the next data category that I'd like to dive into is another one that I think has some broad interest from a number of folks, which is our PSPS data. So here we're showing a snippet of our PSPS event ERD. As mentioned earlier, our PSPS data contains both the event data as well as damage data. So similarly to the other schemas, you have your ID fields here, which would include an event ID, circuit IDs, parcels, utilities, substations, and then event information. And I'll get into some unique things that we would like to track particular to PSPS events that we believe are important. And then moving on, you have additional data at the bottom particular to actual statistics and metrics pertaining to the outages and the impacts. So what are some noteworthy things? So first of all, before we get into that, one thing that I would like to outline here is there are various stages and elements of PSPS data. Obviously, when an event is forecasted to happen, and then while it's occurring, there is a need for near real-time access to information. And the utilities host various data portals. Cal OES hosts portals with outage information and status. However, for the purposes of the Wildfire Safety Division in assessing these events, what we're more so concerned with than real-time access is getting the best and most accurate data specific to what actually happened during the event. So that is the kind of overlying principle of how we approach our PSPS data. So that's, as I mentioned, it's broken out into two schemas, events and damages. Our event boundaries, we want to be able to align with affected parcel boundaries in the long term, and this is going to be able to provide us a consistent resolution and methodology and provide us additional information pertaining to specific PSPS events. PSPS events are broken out into not only polygon data that would show the parcel boundaries or the event boundaries, but would also show line and point data, as we've learned that certain utilities display and track information in different ways, and we want our schema to be flexible to be able to fit into some of those as they're currently collected. And then as it pertains to our PSPS damage schemas, this was really built in collaboration with our partnership with CAL FIRE off of the existing CAL FIRE damage assessment data schema. And we took that and those principles and we built them out specific for collecting PSPS damage data. As many of you may know, there are parallel proceedings and a number of decisions that have influenced how and what needs to be done for PSPS events. One of the aspects of a PSPS event is that 10 days after the event, utilities are required to provide some sort of report to the Safety Enforcement Division and the Commission pertaining to specific details. One aspect of those reports are whether or not particular damage was sustained during the event where the lines were de-energized. And currently, the existing standards don't have a lot of specificity pertaining to how and what type of detail needs to be collected pertaining to damage data. So the Wildfire Safety Division data reporting standards is taking a crack at starting to define what does sufficient and robust data around PSPS damages look like. And as I mentioned earlier, this was really built from the framework of how CAL FIRE approaches to collecting damage assessment data. So particular to the PSPS events, a couple of things that I think are noteworthy that we want to be able to track are additional time categories. So obviously, you know, historically PSPS events start and end times and dates are tracked. Additional information we want to be able to track are when EOCs were activated, when the all clear was given so that inspections could begin and the re-energization process can take place. We require a prediction of how long outages may last, and then a calculation of analyzing based on the actual event what the prediction error was. We included a number of stuff pertaining to critical infrastructure impacts. And then also we keyed into our PSPS event data schema requirement to respond to a number of factors that may or may not have impacted the particular PSPS decision. And then in addition, as I mentioned with damages, this is really built off of the CAL FIRE damage assessment framework and structure. And to that end, we're asking for specific information pertaining to asset information, photos both of the damage as well as the fuel bed in the vicinity of the damage, HFTD location, public resource code exemption status, and a number of similar details similar to the wire down event schemas as they pertain to damages that were sustained to conductors. And then obviously descriptions for damages. One important thing to assess, and we'll kind of cover this later when we talk about the open issues, is there's obviously an existing requirement for the utilities to provide certain data to the Commission within 10 days after the event. However, we understand that some of the data and information in our schema may take longer to develop. And so one of the considerations being what aspects of data might be worthwhile in our PSPS schema to collect in the 10-day report versus what type of data in our PSPS schemas can wait for the next quarterly report submission or some other submission that's more frequent than that but longer than the 10 days. Now, before I move on to the open issues, I would be very remiss. I know I didn't discuss and do a deep dive on our asset schemas, but one thing that I would like to point out that is very important and was a critical aspect of how we move forward with our data schema is in the asset schema, one big push we made across the board is we believe that having a good understanding of age information is critical to understanding wildfire risk. And so to that end, all of our asset schemas, all the various point data I showed you guys and the line data, we have keyed in there 2 elements pertaining to asset age. We allow utilities to identify the exact age of an asset if they have some existing record that shows the installation date, and then the age can be back calculated from an installation date. However, in discussions with utilities and based on our understanding, those records don't always exist. And so to the end that those records don't exist, one of the things that the division has done in our schema is we've provided, if you don't have the exact age, we would like to get an estimated age. And the estimated ages are provided in age ranges, so they would be like 0 to 9 years, 10 to 19 years, 20 to 29 years, so on and so forth. And the idea here is we just want to be able to get in the ballpark to start getting an understanding of where is the aging infrastructure on the system, where are the areas where we might want to do a deeper dive into understanding the risk. So I know I didn't cover the asset schemas in a deep dive, but I did want to point that fact out to you all as you have the time to review and provide your feedback on our schemas. I wanted you to have that context as it pertains to the asset data. So,
great. Coco, this is Arthur, and we do have a question that probably should be addressed here rather than waiting for it. With the first change order due September 11th, what is the expectation for data submissions in that change order? If overall program targets and plans have not changed, is any data required to be submitted?
I will cover that in a bit. I'm actually getting to the kind of some of the timeline issues in this next section. What I will respond to now in regards to that question is there is a very specific process identified in WSD 002 pertaining to what information a utility needs to provide specific to a change order. Now that's separate from these data reporting standards. Change orders have a number of requirements that need to be met. Now, to the extent that there are no change orders for specific initiatives that are going to be reported in the first quarterly report, then those change order fields in our initiative data tables would be blank, right? Or I think we may have a not applicable response category. So to the extent that there are no change orders, then that information as it pertains to that initiative would be blank. However, we would still get the data pertaining to the specific initiative in question. I hope that answers that.
Those are all the questions that we have so far.
Awesome. So what are some open issues? And that was a great kind of segue question, I guess. So the first quarterly reports are actually due on September 9th, not on September 11th. If my calendar math is correct, I'm happy to be corrected there. But in accordance to my calendar math or our calendar math, I believe September 9th is the due date for the first quarterly report. So what does that mean? Well, these data schemas are evolving and in draft currently because we want to be able to present them to you all here, solicit your feedback and input, and recalibrate and refine our schemas based on that input. So in accordance to that, we have this time discrepancy where on September 9th, you have your quarterly reports due. However, as mentioned yesterday, the comments on these workshop materials won't come in until August 26th. So when they come in on August 26th, that does not leave a lot of time between the 26th of August and the 9th of September with the Labor Day holiday in there to adjust, refine, finalize. So because of this, we are taking initially a phased approach, which I will discuss here in the next slide. So what do I mean by phased approach? We're going to ask that all respondent utilities provide us everything that they can in accordance with our existing draft data reporting standards for their September 9th quarterly report submission. However, in addition to that, what we will be doing is we will be providing all the utilities with an Excel file, which we will call a status report template. And this status report template is to be submitted every time in the quarterly report with the data submission. And essentially, if you'll look down here on the left side of the field of this table, this is identical to our schema, our field name, the descriptions, and the field type. So we will have this for every single aspect of our schemas. In addition to that, we will require the utilities to identify whether or not they provided the data in the current quarterly report, why they didn't provide data if they didn't, or why, if data was only partially provided, why it was partially provided. We will require some commentary on what actions the utility has already taken and plans to take to both collect and report the data, and then expectations and timelines of when that data will be provided, and then lastly, whether or not that particular data field is considered confidential. So this template will be provided to the utilities in conjunction with, we're also developing and currently in the process of creating template file geodatabases, which are essentially the structure of the filing that we expect the utilities to follow. So we will provide that to the utilities next week. We're in the process of finalizing and doing some QA/QC on those documents before we submit them, but those will be provided. So the utilities will have next week the file geodatabase templates, which essentially outline all the structure and how the data should be submitted, as well as what we call metadata, which is essentially an explanation of what is in this data submittal, where it comes from, any important information, contacts, so on and so forth. So that, in addition to the status report template, will be provided to the utilities next week. And then from there, we will expect that when the quarterly report submissions come in, that they follow those two things. One is they follow the geodatabase file template that we provided, and two is when they submit the data, that the data is submitted with the status report Excel template to outline what was provided, what was not, and when we can expect those that information to be provided. So that is how we're approaching this kind of fact that we currently have these draft standards that need some refining and tweaking around the edges, and we want to solicit feedback and input from stakeholders before we really make that finalization. So in response to that, what's going to likely happen is that our first two quarterly report data submissions, so that's the September 9th, and then the following quarterly report would be 3 months after that, which would be December 9th, approximately. You know, I haven't done the calendar math on that, but we're expecting that those first two data submissions will be following this draft template. Now, as we move forward and we finalize the template, we will also revise and redline this file, which is the status report file, as well as the geodatabase template that we'll be providing next week, so that they are identically matching to what the final schema looks like. So I just want to caution stakeholders and the utilities to bear with us as we finalize and refine these efforts, that we will have somewhat of an interim product, which I believe is, 90 maybe % of the way there, and waiting until we finalize those. And then so we're expecting to get data submissions in adherence with what we will call our version 1.0 final data standards, starting likely in 2021. So some other issues that I think are important, and I want to encourage any stakeholders who are inclined to file comments on August 26th, to address these issues. One is, we went through our data categories, and I outlined for you guys some relevant aspects of PSPS, risk event, and initiative data. However, in addition to that, what I would like to get feedback on is which of these data or subsets of these data make sense to get in quarterly report submissions, which makes sense to wait for annual update data submissions, and are there aspects of this data that maybe should be submitted more frequently than quarterly? And so the timing around when and how certain data is received is still an open issue, and we would like to facilitate stakeholder input and feedback on that before we finalize. And somewhat related to the timing issue is particular to initiative data. Our understanding and discussions, and we've had numerous very lengthy discussions with all the different utilities. And what we've come to understand is the business processes that different utilities implement to support their operations vary. And in accordance to that, so does the schedules and how the different utilities' workflow processes pertain to updating data that's in their existing databases to track information that we want reported relative to initiatives. So the question then becomes, how does staff, or I'm sorry, how do the utilities, how far back do they report the information? So for example, our first quarterly report submission is coming in on September 9th. Well, that data for initiatives, how far back should it go? Does it go back to the prior 4 months, meaning May 9th to August 9th? Does it go back to the prior 3 to 6 months, March to June? For this initial submission, should we have a one-off where we require everything from January 1st through a certain date and then transition to a different standardized submission schedule? So that is an area where we would love to facilitate feedback, especially from the utilities, in regards to what's feasible and how far back, and pertaining to, and maybe for different initiatives it might vary. So getting some detailed feedback on that and recommendations would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, I want to point out, as it pertains to open issues and soliciting stakeholder feedback, I mentioned the data reporting standards document was sent out last week, I believe on Wednesday, and you all should have, it's about 75-ish pages. You all should have access to that. If you don't, they're also on our Wildfire Safety Division or the Wildfire Mitigation Plan webpage. And what we are going to request is that if any stakeholders want to offer specific edits or recommendations for changes to the schema, that those changes be provided in redline so that we can efficiently track and assess the various changes and more expeditiously move forward to trying to finalize these data schemas after those comments come in. So that would be a recommendation. We will do our best to try and consider recommendations and feedback that's not provided in this format, but it will be very difficult in the time frame. So to the extent that the stakeholders can provide their feedback to specific schema tables in redline, that would be much appreciated and preferred. So with that, I want to just talk about some of our next steps, and then I'll open the floor to some questions. First is, obviously, we're accepting comments through August 26th. As it pertains to the data schema and the data standards, preferably if those comments could come in before the 26th, that would be great. However, August 26th is a deadline for submitting comments, not just on these data standards, but also on the various matters covered during these workshops. So we in the division are planning to publish kind of our final data reporting standards with the other final staff proposals as they pertain to the things that were covered today or in these workshops, safety culture, the WMP guidelines, and so on and so forth. Now, with that, understanding that the first quarterly report submissions will be coming in on September 9th, and as I mentioned before, next week, the division is planning to provide file geodatabase templates and the Excel status report templates for use and for the first quarterly report submissions. So within a very short time, the utilities will have the documents needed to structure their reporting in exactly how we want it, and also provide us status, not just us, but everyone, status on where they stand with fully reporting the data in concert with our existing standards. So that, I believe, is the last slide I had for today. And I know we have about 20-ish minutes. So I've seen, and I haven't been able to monitor the chat myself, but Ryan or Arthur, are there any questions that have been coming in? I did see a note from someone that the Q&A function might not have been working, so there might be some questions that are buried in the chat.
Okay, so in the chat, Coco, we have, it kind of came in a couple of parts, but basically it goes to the concern that the new data schema is asking the utilities for information that they may not already be collecting, okay? That this will require some new activities on the part of the utilities in terms of being able to analyze their activities for this information and provide proper training tools, etc. So that I believe that the question is here, is there going to be a way for the utilities to report a compliance plan towards getting to the ability to fill out the new schema requirements?
Good question. So first off, the person asking the question is absolutely right. As covered in the early intro to this presentation, I mentioned one of the goals here is we want to push the boundaries of existing data collection and reporting. And what does that mean? In reality, that's going to mean that we will be asking for collection and reporting of data that may not be standardized across the board, and everyone may not be doing those or collecting that information. However, we want to move towards doing that, and we believe that the approach we've taken of allowing this to be phased in over time will make the process of adjusting to collecting that data absorbable. And so where we'll be getting the updates are in these Excel status report templates. Those will be being filed with each quarterly report data submission, and they will update what is the status. Was this data provided? If it wasn't provided, why wasn't it provided? What's being done to collect and provide it? When can we expect that? And also whether or not the data is confidential. So what I would say is this is the status report is what you should be looking to evaluate kind of where the utilities are going in regards to their trajectory and being able to fully comply.
Great. Another question is regarding the quarterly reports. Guidance 10 requires data on specified initiatives, including hardening and vegetation management, asset inspections, etc. Can the utilities anticipate requests for data other than those topics in the GIS standards to be included in the quarterly report?
So if you look at the initiative schemas, they're also broken down into those 4 topics that are in Guidance 10. And the idea here is, as I mentioned, this implementation and build out of our data standards and our data strategy is a journey, and it's going to take time. And for us, the idea was to really start from a place where we knew at least the bare minimums we could get. And so to that end, when we talk about initiatives, when you look at the wildfire mitigation plans, a great majority of the spending occurs in two big buckets. One is veg management, the other is grid hardening, right? So to that end, we've broken out veg management into inspections and projects, and then we've broken out asset management into essentially inspections and projects. And so with those four initiatives, which are the exact four initiatives, by the way, that are called out in Guidance 10, we believe that that gets us along, a bulk of the way there. Over time, we may add additional schemas particular to different initiatives. But for right now, we believe that those broad four categories cover a large swath of the various initiatives that are being done particular to utility wildfire mitigation plans. So in the first or second quarterly report, I don't know that I would expect these initiative categories to change. But as we move through the process of finalizing, we are certainly open to doing that. Like I mentioned before, this is really, to a certain extent, somewhat of a living document. As we develop our skill sets, as we gain more understanding, as, frankly, the utilities and discussions with them are all going through different processes currently to restructure how they collect and report data, how they federate the information. So all of these processes, we're kind of in a unique, what oftentimes I call a renaissance period when it comes to transparency and sharing of data. We're all reassessing the problem, and it's an opportune time for us to push these boundaries on data collection and reporting, because all of the utilities are in a process where they're revamping their internal abilities and capabilities for doing this stuff as well. So I hope that answers the question. Happy to take any other questions as well.
Okay, I have a couple more that have come in. When the data are submitted, who will be reviewing it? And how does WSD assess compliance with the data requests? And how do we plan to get back to the utilities, to note deficiencies or ask for more information?
So the who will be reviewing it, that's the Wildfire Safety Division. We're currently staffing up in the Wildfire Safety Division. We've recently concluded interviews for hiring a research data manager, and eventually we will have a research data team, which will have its own manager and a number of employees that report under that person. In the long term, that's kind of going to be our data hub and group that would likely be overseeing these submissions. Until that team is fully staffed up, it's really just like everything else we've done in the Wildfire Safety Division, pretty much a team effort. As far as compliance goes, this is where this is why I wanted to come back to this slide here. When we talk about compliance, we're understanding that we're throwing a lot at the utilities, and this is a lot of information. It's structured in a way that may not always fit in well to how existing processes are, how existing data is structured. And to that end, we understand that we need to be reasonable in understanding that it's going to take time for utilities to come into what you may call full compliance with these reporting standards. And with the acknowledgement that these standards currently are in draft form and they'll be finalized later this year, right? So as we go through the process, we will be tracking in accordance with the information that's submitted with the status report templates, how and where the utilities are and how far they're coming along and what their estimated delivery time frame is to provide full compliance. However, we're not expecting everyone to be able to fully comply. However, that being said, we strongly expect and encourage all the utilities to provide as much of this information as is currently available, and we will be evaluating this information pertaining to why things were not provided to better assess what the next actions might be of the division. So that's, I think, the best answer I can give you right now.
Okay. Somebody wanted to pin you down to a 3 to 5 year time frame for full compliance. I think that We'll just say it happens when it happens. But the second part of that question is, how will cost recovery of the changes that are necessary in order to meet the data schema to be handled? I'll just say that WSD doesn't have anything to do with cost recovery, that there are the mechanisms in the PUC, memo accounts, et cetera, that can be raised within the WMP proceeding, and or we may address it in the resolution, but I don't think that we have an answer to that question yet.
And what I would just build off of that, Arthur, I totally agree with what you said. The other thing that I want to mention is a lot of the elements of data collection that might not be currently done, much of it, I believe, can be incorporated into existing processes where data is collected. So, for example, in accordance with General Order 165, electric utilities have a requirement to inspect every single asset in their infrastructure on a 5-year cycle, at least, right? So from today, 5 years from today, every asset should be inspected. So as part of those inspections, you can, I believe, with fairly minimal increased costs, start collecting additional information. For example, one of the areas where we're trying to push for additional data collection is on slices. Where are the slices in the system? What type of slices are they? How many are there? Well, most utilities, from my understanding, may not have a robust data set to speak to that, and may not even collect that data as it exists as part of normal business practice. However, as part of doing a detailed inspection, when you have an inspector on the field collecting data on the assessment of the pole or a crossarm or whatever, it shouldn't be too much more difficult to key in an additional assessment, a visual assessment of where and how many slices there are, right? So there are ways in which the cost for doing these additional data collection processes can be absorbed likely into other work. But those are things that are, A, cost recovery, like Arthur mentioned, is not considered in the WMP proceeding. However, we're more than glad to help support and assess any or comment on any of those areas as needed by our colleagues in the Energy Division or Public Advocate's Office or whomever.
Okay, and then a clarification on the previous question regarding the quarterly report, and I'll just read it. It says, are other data categories like wires down not needed to be included in the first quarterly report, since you didn't mention them?
I thought I mentioned wires down, but yes. So the first quarterly report, our ask is, the schema has already been sent out. It was sent out last week. It's out. It's public. In accordance with how those standards are set up, we expect that in the first quarterly report submissions, the utilities provide everything that they have that can fit into our existing schema. Now, to the extent that data doesn't exist, we're not going to ask a utility to fabricate information, right? We want actual data. And to the end that they may not collect certain data, we want to know that too. And that type of information is what we would be expecting to get in the status report template. So these submissions will come in conjunction as an attachment to the data submissions that come in for the quarterly report.
So follow the template.
We are expecting wire down and all the other data that I covered, and even the data I did not cover, to be submitted as part of these first quarterly report submissions.
Okay. I'm not seeing another question, but very early on in the conversation, somebody raised a point about near miss, and we are going to have to deal with the definition of near miss. And the point is that traditionally near misses are used to talk about safety incidents involving workers as opposed to assets. And this person is recommending a different term. I'll just point out that near misses is an evolving term in the utility industry, that in things like airlines, it's not just about worker safety, it's about anything that could lead to an accident. And I think that's where we're heading. So, Coco, you want to add to that?
I agree. Where we landed on this issue was near miss in and of itself is a broad term. It means nothing, right? So you have to define what are the series of events that constitute a near miss. And for us, what we elected to do is, instead of embarking on this journey to define an ambiguous term, we decided, no, we're better off defining specific risk events that we believe are indicative of utility wildfire risk. And this is what we've done: ignition data, outage data, wire down data, veg cause outage data, right? So to us, I'm less concerned with how we define a near miss or what it means, and I'm more concerned with what are the specific types of risk events that we want to track that we believe are both leading and or lagging indicators of an ignition. So obviously ignitions is the most, patently obvious data to collect as far as risk events go. We already have an existing structure based on a 2014 decision. And then from there, it's what other types of risk events do we want to know about? So the reason we want to leverage and utilize outage to begin with is because outages are really, and by the way, I should have said this before, and it's in the schema, but I realized I neglected to mention this. When we talk about outages, we're only talking about unplanned outages. And we're also, though, not limiting it to only sustained outages. We're wanting to track information about unplanned outages, both momentary and sustained. And the delineation there being outages that last less than 5 minutes are considered momentary, and others are considered sustained outages. And while I'm speaking of this, I did get a question, I think it might have come to me privately in the chat, regarding fault data. And so what I wanted to say to that was, we had to really pare and scope down what we could do with this schema, given the time frame, given our resources, and given the schedule. And so to that end, what we wanted to do was we wanted to figure out where is the existing data, how can we federate, structure it, and how do we define some of this stuff and tie it together through ID fields or the various related tables. And so fault data is something that we believe is very informative to particular risk events. However, currently, we're not at a place that we could have properly structured that for this initial round of submittals. However, as I mentioned before, I think what we're doing with collecting the outage data gets us a step in that right direction. And then from there, understanding that this will be somewhat of a living document. It'll be updated and modified as appropriate. And as I mentioned before, currently our a data team is minimally staffed, to put it mildly. But in the very near future, we will be elevating and kind of expanding that team. And so as we expand our capabilities and get more resources, we'll be able to take on more stuff and develop and modify things more rapidly. I did also get another question that came in regarding how folks would access this data. So my understanding is, and this is where the data would come to the division, and we will be providing some instructions. We've created, and I didn't put this in my slide deck but because it just recently happened, but we created a shared inbox called Wildfire Data at cpuc.ca.gov, which is where we'll ask that all these quarterly report data submissions come into, because we expect that these will be fairly large files that will not be transmittable through standard email. And so we'll ask that they're sent to us through the CPUC secure file transfer portal, Kiteworks, and sent directly to that email inbox, which everyone in our team will have access to. Once that data is submitted, we will have to go through an assessment of the status report to evaluate what is and is not considered confidential. That may require some back and forth with the utilities to make sure we're all on the same page as it pertains to confidentiality, right? And once we've identified what data is not confidential, I'm open, and if parties want to, or stakeholders want to comment on the sharing of this data, we're open to suggestions. However, I expect that they can either be provided on the WSD webpage pertaining to what's publicly available, and or provided through some existing utility portal. These are types of issues that we'll have to resolve over time. So, any suggestions or thoughts are greatly appreciated. But I think that's the best answer I can give you on that one. I think that came from Joe Mitchell.
Okay. We have 3 minutes left, and there is a question here. I'm not exactly sure how to interpret it. I'm interpreting it as a question of how is this reporting of data going to be matched against actual verification in the field, and kind of like what's that timing or coordination between it? The example that was given is if a C-hook or jumper is found to be non-compliant at fire risk from the monitoring, will reporting follow that, or does that come before the reporting? I'm not quite sure. This may need to be fleshed out in the comments on the workshop. But, Dogo, do you have any stab at that?
I think I understood the question. I'll answer what I think I understood. So there are elements of inspections that are done by the utilities that identify non-compliance issues that are particularly, amplify wildfire risk. So the Wildfire Safety Division has a branch, our compliance branch, who goes out in the field and does inspections pertaining to programs and inspections and different things the utilities did, particular to their wildfire mitigation plan. I'm not sure I understood the whole, if a utility identifies an issue in the field, that would be then presumably reported to us in their asset inspection data that they report. However, I think the question that's specifically being asked is maybe better answered by someone in the compliance branch, because I don't want to misspeak on their behalf as to how they're executing some of their compliance tasks.
Okay, I'm going to ask for any further questions. We have time for one more. Anything else here? Let's see. Somebody sent questions to the host, but they're not sure they're coming through. I did not see those. Let's see. What about items that have open claims or legal holds because of investigations?
What items are we talking about?
Got me. It says items that have open claims or legal holds because of investigations. I presume they're referring to any current investigations that the Commission is doing that may prevent access to information. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, as it pertains to, for example, for the, and this is the last question I can probably answer. As it pertains to, for example, our ignition schema, one thing that I did point out was, if I can get to the slide here, we did ask about investigation status, whether or not there was an open investigation. But I'm not sure exactly what issues they're pertaining to. I assume it's maybe ignition data. So we're asking for information pertaining to the status of an investigation. I would also point out that as it pertains to ignitions, in the 2020 WMP guidelines, we specifically clarified that the ignition data we wanted was ignition data as it was reported and found by the fire authority having jurisdiction. So whether or not there's a contention of the particular findings of a fire authority's investigation, we still expect that report to be, or that data to be reported to us. However, the investigation status of that could be ongoing, or we also provide for comment fields where a utility may indicate you know, this was found by the fire authority. However, we, the utility, you know, dispute those claims or those findings. So I think that kind of answers the question, but I'm not sure I understood it very well. So I apologize if we missed it, and happy to, you know, take any of that feedback in comments that'll come in on the 26th or before if possible.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Coco. We are currently scheduled for a 15-minute break. It's now on my clock says 11:16. Let's come back at 11:30 so that we can move on to the safety culture discussion. And thank you all for your participation. This is very technical stuff, and we appreciate your attention.
All lines are open.
Welcome back, everyone, to the home stretch of our 2 days of Wildfire Safety Division workshops for updates to the Wildfire Mitigation Plan, Data Schema, and now we're going to be talking about safety culture assessment. I'm Arthur O'Donnell. I'm a senior analyst with the Wildfire Safety Division, and I very much appreciate you joining us today. I wish I could see you all and kind of share this with you in person, but we're doing our best under current circumstances. Okay, I'm going to begin with just an explanation of how what we're doing for WSD differs from what the Commission has to do in its safety culture investigations. Now, many of you are aware that the legislature has given us a charge to come up with a process for assessing safety culture of the electric utilities by December 1st of this year, and to do that assessment on an annual basis. So that's really our charge and what we're going to be talking about today. Separately, and before that, the legislature had told the Commission that they needed to do 5-year assessments of safety culture for all utilities, all energy utilities. Currently, there are 2 open proceedings that do that. One is I-15-08019, and that's the investigation into the safety culture of Pacific Gas and Electric. And the other is I-19-06014, which was just opened last year, and that's an investigation into safety culture of Sempra Energy and Southern California Gas. San Diego Gas and Electric is not currently implicated in that investigation. That arose out of several safety incidents with SoCalGas, including Aliso Canyon and some others that the Commission has been investigating. Those proceedings are currently kind of in transition. The PG&E case has been going on since 2015, and it got a little, I'll call it, waylaid by the Pacific Gas and Electric bankruptcy filing. And so the Commission ended up opening a separate investigation into the bankruptcy case and the reorganization plan. And that came out with a decision earlier this year that essentially conditionally approved the plan based on certain things that PG&E had to do. That left some questions about what to do about the underlying safety culture investigation. And not long ago, the administrative law judge in that case put out questions about how should we proceed and asked for comments on 5 options. And the 5 options basically boil down to keeping the proceeding open for monitoring, keeping it open to add new issues that might arise, keeping it open to address kind of threads that kind of are still hanging from the past, or closing it, right? And comments on that request for comments just came in the past week or so. I think they were August 4th, with about 10 parties weighing in. And, you know, I would just urge you, if you have an interest, to go to the docket files for this proceeding and see what people say. From my reading of the comments, only Pacific Gas and Electric and CPUC, which is the representation for utility employees, would like to see the proceedings closed and, if necessary, open up a new proceeding. Other parties that range from community choice aggregators or shareholder interests or kind of ratepayer interests have various interests in continuing to keep the proceeding open. So that there's no determination in that yet. It might be a couple of weeks before the judge gets around and kind of decides what should be done. This is not a democracy. We're not going to take the top 5 votes out of 10. It's really what the Commission wants to do and what the rationale for doing that going forward is. With regard to the Sempra proceeding, just recently there was issued not a scoping memo, but a description from the judge and the assigned commissioner essentially on the process and the schedule for the proceeding. And that verified that this is really about SoCalGas and Sempra Energy, which is the holding company for it. And really the focus is organizational culture, governance, policies, practices, accountability metrics in relation to operations and in particular relationship to safety incidents. There's a secondary issue on there, which is how to treat a root cause analysis report called the Blade Report that was about the Aliso Canyon gas leak that, at least in this ruling from the judge and the commissioner, that it is open and fair game for the consultant to the proceeding to look into that to see how it may reflect on safety culture. And if the utility wants to kind of limit that, then they can argue that during the case. This was opened last June, and only recently in this June was a consultant to the Safety Enforcement Division identified. And that consultant is a Swedish company called 2EC AB, Evolving Energy Consortium. So they're new to practice. We haven't seen them here in California before. They are just getting off the ground. The only formal activity in that proceeding has been allowing SEPRA to set up a memorandum account to log the costs of doing that. We anticipate to see a pre-hearing conference date set pretty much in the near term, and then that will establish the scoping and schedule for the proceedings. So that's where we are now with those two proceedings. I'll just point out that the issues that came up in those proceedings are kind of very deep compared to what we expect our charge to be. When these proceedings were initiated, the Commission kind of puts out its original order opening an investigation, and it just kind of gave some basic expectation for what safety culture should entail. And this is written into the staff documents that we shared with everybody before the workshop, and it's available on the PUC's website. I'm not going to open it up here, but I just will say that for both of the preliminary sense of what safety culture entails in that 5-year assessment is that a public utility whose organizational structure and governance prioritize safety, make safety a primary objective of the entire organization, encourages employees to report safety concerns with non-punitive outcomes, and that achieves a positive record of safe operation. And that can be a utility that's described as possessing a high-functioning safety culture. So you might look at that as kind of where we're heading and what we would like to see. Our presentation today is going to talk about some of the specific ideas that we have on how the Commission can assess that and document those things. So I'll just move on to the next. The safety assessments is one of 5 inputs to the safety certification for wildfire mitigation. As you know, the legislation, AB 1054, established the safety certification so that the utilities can participate in the wildfire insurance pool, and having that certification kind of, gives the Commission an indication of kind of how to assess requests for funding from that pool should they be necessary going forward, right? If you're in good standing, then you're more likely to get what you ask for. We have not exercised that yet. Other elements of this are, of course, the Wildfire Mitigation Plan approval status, compliance with the WMP. There are certain requirements that the legislature has put into effect with regard to board structure and expertise, and we'll talk about that, and an executive compensation structure. We have not yet proposed what WSD is looking at with regard to the executive compensation structure. That's going to be a next order of business after these workshops, but all of this will be entailed in the forthcoming resolution with guidelines for WMP and for what we're recommending to the Commission for approval with regard to the processes that are set out for the safety culture assessments and the safety certification. Okay, as I mentioned, there is specific language in the Public Utilities Code now for WSD to come up with by December 1st a process to conduct annual safety culture assessments for each electrical corporation, right? And with regard to the safety certification, the executive director of the Commission has to kind of like make a finding that the corporation is in good standing, and one way that that could be satisfied is by the corporation's agreement to implement any findings of the safety culture assessment. There are also some other elements, which is that the board of directors of each utility needs to have a safety committee. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that because that we're building on that requirement. When we look at safety culture, it's really about how we behave in our context of work. Who gets hired? Who gets fired? Who gets promoted? How goals are set? How safety is discussed in key meetings? Who is a hero in the organization? What projects are funded? How we measure and incentivize the actions that we want to see, and in particular, how we react to incidents. And all of this comes into play. It really boils down to how work gets done. Our task is to kind of bring this broad safety culture discussion and understanding into the particular context of wildfire safety, right? So what we're going to be looking at essentially are overall safety culture indicators within the organization, right? As well as specifics to wildfire safety. And that's what we're going to be asking you to comment on after the workshop, your ideas that can help formulate the process that we're looking forward to. And as we go forward, you'll see the tools that we have, right? Basically, we're trying to match it with the vision that Wildfire Safety Division has, which is to establish a baseline for culture, right? To measure over time, to be data-driven in our insights, right? Not just, kind of like gut or kind of subject matter experts, but really to base this as much as possible on outcome metrics, to ground this as well in assessment of drivers of wildfire risk, and to put wildfire safety in the broader context, right? So all of this should lead to a kind of a continuous improvement process where we're learning and driving towards that goal that I expressed previously of what an organization with a high-functioning safety culture looks like. Okay. There are a number of elements that fit together in this, and I won't go into detail on this slide because basically you can see that you have board structure, you have executive compensation, structure and governance, organizational systems, leadership, and how that influences outcomes, right? Frontline behavior, worker interfaces, systems, and external factors that may put constraints on this. Really what we're looking at here are the two elements on the right-hand side of this slide, which is the culture, a measure of the organization's culture, and the foundation, which can be measured through reporting. Okay? So there's a couple of things that we could do to really assess culture. There have been a lot of proven methods for assessing culture in many different types of organizations, and we're trying to identify the ones that are relevant to our purposes. And also in terms of the organizational foundation, which is to talk about the structure, governance, and systems that influence safety within the utilities. Now, I will point out that over the past couple of weeks, we've had fairly deep conversations with each of the large electric utilities about their safety culture practices. And we learned a lot. We learned that all of the utilities are pursuing multiple initiatives for their organization. I mean, everything from establishing their safety policies and making sure that that's built into the training, to doing employee surveys, to participating in industry benchmark operations. The National Safety Council has a biennial kind of matching where they go deeply into the utility structure and do employee surveys. All of those are useful tools, and what we want to do is to be able to draw on those, leverage those, as well as come up with things that we are particularly interested that are particular to wildfire safety. Okay, these are really part of the goals, which is to drive down the aggregate risk from wildfire and the public safety power shutoffs, reduce deaths in serious industries, minimize financial damage and acres burned, and maintain the reliability of the service by reducing the extent and duration of outages that are associated with either PSPS events or even wildfires, and also to drive down safety risks for employees. And employees also entails contractors and the public. Okay. In particular, we'll be looking at catastrophic wildfire events, injuries and fatalities from wildfire mitigation activities, but we're not focused, WSD is not really focused on things outside that realm. Accidents not related to wildfire activities, gas explosions, things like that. That really is part of the realm of the 5-year annual assessment for all of the utilities. Okay? So here are some of the tools that we're considering using, right? They're broken into these categories. Guideline response, which is essentially asking for information from the utilities that provides a documentation or assurance that they have a safety culture, that these are the mechanisms that they have in place. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. Management self-assessments, all right? We in the WMP had used something called a maturity model, in which we asked the utilities to assess where they were on a spectrum of maturity in certain capabilities that were related to wildfire safety. There are some elements within that maturity model that we think may be appropriate for this exercise, in particular organizational learning, emergency preparedness. Those are some of the tools that we're thinking of using. And then employee surveys, interviews, or observational visits. I think that the big caveat here is that Wildfire Safety Division is resource constrained. You've heard that from us on a number of occasions. We really don't have a full staffing yet. Hopefully a year from now we'll have full staffing. But we're building as we go, and so we've relied on outside experts to help us formulate these ideas, and may have to rely on third parties, right, in order to conduct some of these tools. Okay. Our objectives for the guideline response really is to verify compliance, right? Some of the things that we've identified is in legislation, each utility should have a safety committee of the board of directors, okay? What is the responsibility of that? In the Pacific Gas and Electric Chapter 11 case, the commission specifically charged that safety committee of the board with overseeing WMPs and the policies surrounding the public safety power shutoffs, and for reporting to the board and to the commission about safety matters. Okay, there is discussion about the qualifications for candidates of the board of directors. Again, in the Pacific Gas and Electric case, 3 areas of expertise were recommended for anybody being appointed to the board, including wildfire safety, gas safety for the combined gas and electric utilities, and bigger picture kind of safety issues like cybersecurity. And it was also recommended that directors who are appointed who possess those safety credentials also serve on the safety committee. We've also told PG&E that they should employ a chief safety officer. One of the things about recommending these as a baseline for safety governance is that we understand utilities are already doing this. They may not have specified the particular responsibilities for the safety committee at the board of directors, but each of the large utilities that we've talked to has some form of a safety committee, whether it's the Nuclear and Safety Operations Committee or the Safety and Reliance Committee. There is something there in place already. We've already talked to the chief safety officers, or whatever their titles are, so there are equivalent people at that level. What we're more concerned with than the title is what the responsibility of that person is and who they're reporting to. And we really want to see a direct link between that executive level, staff, field operations, the board of directors, and the commission. So that's what we're going to be looking for. Okay, those are pretty much checklist kind of items, right? So that, you know, and we would consider those a basic. A management self-assessment. Now, don't get too hung up on the format here. This is just an idea because, again, what we're looking for are kind of either ways to show that safety culture is being pursued within the organization and to assess how it's progressing, right? How close are we to the goal? What has to happen in order to reach the goal? And that's what we're going to want to see. So we'd like to have some discussion, especially in the comments, about what those structures ought to be for the commission to be looking at, for the WSD to be looking at in the annual assessment. Now, some ideas could be having targets and a plan to meet those targets, or having a questionnaire, or having deep dive interviews with management. We haven't decided exactly how to go. A lot of it depends on what kind of resources we have. Finally, employee surveys are commonly used tools in many organizations. The question here is, who gets the survey? How extensive is the survey? What is the survey actually kind of measuring? And can we trust that the utilities are not being pressured to answer in a positive way? So those are challenges, right? And I hope that in the discussion that follows this presentation, we can talk about some of those challenges. But some of the questions that might be asked are procedures being followed? Do employees feel comfortable raising safety concerns, right? Do they feel that management values safety? There are some more practical things that I think that we'll hear about, which is, if there are processes in place, have you used them, right? And what's been your experience with them? So that provides a kind of a source of truth. Okay. Interviews, observational visits. We do have, Wildfire Safety Division has a compliance branch, and they're out in the field. Part of the vetting and the verification of what utilities are telling us can be accomplished by that branch if they're out in the field watching a field crew. I'll just give you an example that came out of the Pacific Gas and Electric proceeding, which is that before any outside work, the crew gets together for what is essentially a tailgate safety discussion, right? Where the supervisor, person in charge, the lead in charge, goes over what the job is, and people contribute their ideas as to what safety risks they might encounter and what they would do in that circumstance. This is, you know, a really good tool that gets everybody on the same page, right? And so, you know, we can verify that that's happening if we're out there in the field. Otherwise, we have to rely on employees telling us, well, you know, we used to do that, but we don't do it anymore. We don't know, right? That's something that we really need to be able to assess. Okay. And then that's pretty much all I have. I will encourage folks to look at the staff proposal, which has a little bit more information about it, but really today is about getting ideas and taking feedback. So we have Andrew Martinez from Southern California Edison and Angela Anderson, who is a principal with North Star Consulting. North Star is the consultant that the Utilities Commission hired to oversee the PG&E safety culture investigation. And, you know, kind of like in 2017, they issued a 300-page report that was very deep dive in terms of what they saw from multiple field visits to PG&E, dozens, if not scores, of interviews with people, hundreds of data requests. It was very thorough and came up with 60 recommendations, and PG&E has kind of pledged to follow those recommendations, and they're on their path towards compliance with all of those recommendations. So with that, I'm going to ask our IT folks to make sure that Angela is open and available to talk with us right now. Angela is available. Angela, can you give me a sound check?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes. Take the table for, 7-10 minutes. We have time.
Sure. And I'm going to talk about some of the kind of overarching challenges that you're facing, as well as then get into some of the details on some of the proposed assessment steps, and also hopefully add a little bit of input on some things that might be added or considered as part of the process. So obviously this is a challenge for the Wildfire Safety Division because we've got the existing safety culture assessments, which were very time-consuming and in-depth, as well as the need to do these on an annual basis. I think one of the really critical questions is, are the utilities assessing the risks and making the decisions necessary to mitigate those risks and ensure wildfire safety? That is not necessarily one organizational unit. It could be parts of units, and usually when you're assessing safety culture, it's of a base of people. And so the challenge is going to be, how do we target that and narrow it and address the organizations without then, keeping the focus on wildfire safety as opposed to just addressing culture broadly or as a whole. As an example for PG&E, during some of the inspection and the processes that they were going through that were mandated by the federal monitor, they had gas operations assisting with the electric operation safety efforts. So we don't necessarily, you may not know the organizational overlaps that are going on within the utility, and that's something that would need to be considered depending on how you're looking at it, if you're not looking at it for the organization as a whole. One of the other large issues is that the connection between the safety certification and the wildfire insurance fund, the wildfire fund, creates a perverse incentive, whether intentional or unintentional, for the utility to attempt to present the best picture possible. They need the safety certification, and that can bias some of the activities that one might do in performing the self-assessment. The other thing that's a challenge is the time and effort it takes simply to assess safety culture. And we know that the Wildfire Safety Division is a little bit resource constrained right now. So if I were going to go through the current structure and how that balances basically what's efficient and cost-effective with more data-driven elements, I would say that the initial compliance assessment, that's data-driven. It is not going to require significant time by the Wildfire Safety Division. The utilities will be providing that information. The management self-assessment or maturity model that you have built into the plan currently does create the potential for utility bias. You may have comparability issues if you're trying to compare across the electric corporations, and ultimately you would want to try to adopt some sort of form of being able to validate that information. Employee surveys, again, have, and I'll touch on employee surveys a bit more in a second, they also have a similar kind of bias to them. Metrics, which are part of this, I know that you guys are collecting a lot of data, and metrics are important, but we need to make sure, the Wildfire Safety Division would need to make sure that you have a balanced set of metrics so that if there's a potential for an unintended consequence, you might be capturing a commensurate metric that's going to address whether that's actually occurring or not. So when we get to interviews, observations, site visits, those are more accurate, as one might define in terms of safety culture assessments, but they are more time-consuming. So that poses a challenge. And then there are other validation methods that one could go through, so looking at utility observation data or asking for trending, document reviews, reviewing policies and procedures. Those are also data-driven but more time-intensive. I think that the current plan, with some additions and caveats, tries to do a good job of balancing the need for data supportable and validatable information with the cost effectiveness of some of the broader categories, but there are still some challenges. So specifically with respect to employee surveys, most of the major utilities are likely conducting them already, but the focus may not have been directly on safety. It might be an element, but they might be more of a employee engagement, organizational health focus than specifically safety. questions may have changed over time, which might prevent comparability or trending from one period to the next. These surveys are not always conducted annually. I do know that for a while PG&E was doing theirs biannually. They're generally performed by a vendor, which may consider it confidential and not be as interested in providing details on questions. And the safety questions may not be necessarily specific. So there may be a question in there that addresses, does an employee, for example, feel safe stopping work? But you might want to have a commensurate question asking, have you ever actually stopped work? So you may want to get more specific and focus on some of the negatives or focus more on wildfire safety than the existing surveys are doing right now. The actual instruments probably vary by the utility. And then there are problems with any of these types of surveys. Employees may believe they're not truly confidential. You need a high response rate, particularly to protect confidentiality and to make sure that your data is valid. There is the potential for management influence, and a lot of outside factors can affect an employee's response. So I would have anticipated, for example, at PG&E, that a number of the responses to the employee surveys would have gone down during bankruptcy because employees are concerned about whether they're going to have a job. Morale is at is probably at an all-time low. There are lots of things that can influence the way an employee answers. They could have had a bad encounter with their boss. These are point-in-time things that are done that will have some bias built into them. Now, one of the benefits, they already exist, probably, for many of the utilities, and so could be used. They're also useful for identifying whether you are seeing differences by organizational unit. So are the people that are inspecting, poles and other facilities reporting very different results than vegetation management organization within electric? Or are we seeing, just differences in deviations between the organizations may point to problems? The results of these surveys could be used to guide interviews. So you could do a deep dive in looking at them, and that may lead to questions. If the employee surveys are done with open-ended questions or allow employees to comment, and you are able to access what is referred to as the verbatims, which is the actual language and comments employees are making, that can provide valuable insight into the culture of the organization. So there's some trade-offs with surveys. If the Commission were wanting to, or the Wildfire Safety Division were wanting to design its own survey, that is a particular science and would have to be done carefully, and that is going to be much less cost-effective than using an existing survey tool. In terms of metrics, there are existing wildfire mitigation plan metrics that could be used. Findings from inspections on grid condition and vegetation management, risk spend efficiency, near misses, utility inspection findings, PSPS hours. There may be some data that's going to be captured in that data schema that could be captured, but then there also could be metrics that would be developed that get more at the culture. Do employees feel empowered to question things, to stop things if they don't see something safe? Are we not just having a questioning attitude, but is our workforce wanting to do the right thing? And those two things are different. So there are a lot that could be developed. I think it's good to have a blend of leading indicators, some of the outcome metrics and some of the progress metrics that are already anticipated in the wildfire mitigation plans. But then metrics would need to be very, very carefully defined so that they're being reported consistently from one period to the next and consistently amongst the utilities. And then ultimately, as the Wildfire Safety Division ramps up and has greater staffing, ways to validate the accuracy of the information being reported and the consistency of the information being reported would be critical. In terms of some suggestions for the plan to get to maybe more more of the data-driven elements or more of the external validation of what the utility is saying, one could add focus groups of employees. It gets you a larger number of employees providing input in a shorter amount of time. If there's resource constraints, I would suggest interviewing the bargaining unit leaders, because they will have a great deal of information on what they believe the safety culture of the organization is and how it's evolved over time, as well as some of the pitfalls and challenges they're facing. Surveys of other stakeholders might provide additional benefit. Some of the emergency response agencies, Cal OES, places like that, organizations like that. I could deep dive ultimately into metrics and some of the questions that I think should go into the maturity model, but for now I think I've probably covered my 6 to 7 minutes.
Angela, thank you. I do have a question. Is that one of the things that the Commission had looked at for safety culture is that the utility have a specific policy that is clearly articulated set of principles and values and expectation of full compliance. When North Star did the assessment of PG&E, you really faulted them for not having a plan. So can you draw a distinction for us between a set of principles or policies and a plan?
Yes, I'll try to do that using PG&E as an example. One of the challenges that you have in many organizations is that there's a corporate safety function, which is really like an EH&S function. And then you have in a utility the lines of business and the field resources that are also handling safety. And every employee needs to own safety, but there becomes this tension between corporate and potentially the lines of business and the field in terms of who's doing what, who's responsible for safety, who's responsible for the observations. And what we found at PG&E is that surprisingly, given their size, there was not the analytical data horsepower we would have expected behind some of the development of initiatives to improve their safety performance, and they had no comprehensive strategy that addressed how we would get there. So the strategy is broader than the procedures. The procedures are what the employees are adhering to get the work done and get the work done safely. And they should be clear to the employees. They should understand why they're doing what they're doing, and they should really be involved in developing those procedures. And they need to be updated, because what can happen over time is procedure books just expand and expand, and nobody can keep track of it anymore, and they're not manageable, or they're outdated, or they may be conflicting. We encountered procedures between the lines of business that were different at PG&E. And that isn't necessary in many cases. So it was the overall strategy for, basically how we want to deal with our performance issues that was missing at PG&E, as well as procedural issues.
Great. And then one last question. Yeah, one last question, which was utilities or companies start a lot of initiatives, and I think a fault that you found was that there weren't ways to really measure the effectiveness of those initiatives. Can you give us an idea of how we might take that into consideration?
I would take that specifically as it relates to wildfires. If there's a possibility to, through the data that you're collecting, be able to evaluate where the utilities are spending their money and making their improvements. Are those, let's say we're dealing with circuit hardening. Are the circuits they've hardened proving to be the ones that have mitigated an ignition or a problem? Or are we finding that now, we've gone through a system hardening effort and we still have new circuits or new systems that are failing on us? So I think that trying to tie the decision-making process to whether it mitigated a fire would be the best way to pull that together.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that there'll be some questions from the audience. I'd like to turn it over to Andrew with Southern California Edison. Andrew, can you give us a sound check? And
yes, can you hear me, Arthur?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Are you ready for me to go ahead and get started?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Just dive right in.
So thank you for the opportunity on behalf of Southern California Edison and the other utilities to provide initial comments and reactions on the Wildfire Safety Division's proposal for developing a safety culture assessment process. We reviewed the draft recommendations and appreciate and agree with the Wildfire Safety Division's objectives that utilities have a strong safety culture that helps mitigate wildfire risk and reduce public safety power shutoff impacts. However, certain aspects of the proposal do raise some concerns. The safety governance requirements taken from the Commission's decision approving PG&E's bankruptcy plan and related documents are not appropriate for other utilities. Wildfire Safety Division proposes generalizing certain requirements established in PG&E's reorganization plan decision for safety governance at both the Board of Directors and senior management levels of electric utilities. Safety governance requirements are already covered in Assembly Bill 1054 regarding utilities being in good standing. These include establishing a safety committee with relevant safety experience, reporting and implementing board safety recommendations, and reporting to the CPUC on safety issues. Additional or different safety governance requirements arising from the PG&E bankruptcy proceeding that were born of specific circumstances and situations that are unique to one utility that would provide oversight over day-to-day operations are atypical and unwarranted. The narrow and prescriptive approach proposed for safety is unnecessary. We are already meeting Assembly Bill 1054 requirements and have established good corporate safety governance via our safety committees, executive roles, reporting relationships, and various safety culture assessment programs and processes that have been strengthened over a number of years. For example, in my role as Southern California Edison's Vice President of Safety, Security, and Business Resiliency, I routinely report to both our Chief Executive Officer, Executive Vice President of Operations, as well as our Board of Directors Safety and Operations Committee. Southern California Edison's Safety and Operations Committee, in turn, has oversight over our Wildfire Mitigation Plan, and this oversight, including recommendations and management implementation of committee recommendations, is reported in quarterly AB 1054 filings to the Commission. Each utility has to retain ownership, responsibility, and accountability regarding its safety culture and how that translates to wildfire safety. The rigidity of requirements for reporting relationships, backgrounds, and governance imposed due to the unique circumstances associated with bankruptcy proceedings should not be the guide. Such prescriptive approaches from regulators, in fact, can be counterproductive in terms of resource allocation, administrative overhead, and agility to respond to emerging issues and new information. For example, requiring specific wildfire mitigation backgrounds for board members and executives, along with the knowledge of utility operations, asset management, and risk management is just not practical. Moreover, having a chief safety officer who is responsible for the Wildfire Mitigation Plan is not practical. In fact, the separation creates an appropriate check and balance. Wildfire Mitigation Plan is largely about grid design, system hardening, asset management, and operations. The chief safety officer should have input and influence over the Wildfire Mitigation Plan, but not be responsible for it. I would like to highlight several things that we are currently doing in terms of governance, which underscore our focus on safety culture and wildfire safety. Through wildfire mitigation is a relatively emergent field, our executives have important transferable experience and qualifications that are necessary to appropriately plan, execute, and oversee wildfire mitigation. In particular, Southern California Edison's Safety and Operations Committee members possess diverse experience across worker safety, public safety, safety culture, utility operations, cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, and environmental protection. In addition, there is an active collaboration, exchange of ideas, and coordination with agencies that have deep fire suppression and fire response expertise. We also routinely engage with other utilities across California, the nation, and globally to learn and incorporate new technologies and approaches to mitigate wildfire risk. We recognize and agree with the Commission's objectives that utilities have strong safety cultures that help mitigate wildfire risk and public safety power shutoff impacts. The utilities that have already demonstrated their focus on safety and wildfire mitigation or have demonstrated progress must be held accountable for the what, while being afforded the managerial flexibility to determine the how. We believe that AB 1054 process and requirements of Wildfire Mitigation Plan approvals on safety certification is working. The other challenge we find in the proposed approach is the intermingling of safety culture and wildfire mitigation outcome metrics. Safety culture and wildfire mitigation are distinct, albeit interrelated issues, and should not be conflated. The objective of safety culture is to have every employee in the organization, regardless of level, thinking about personnel, team, and public safety in all that they do, and using a shared language and approach in doing so. Having a strong safety culture will, by definition, lead to improved wildfire safety outcomes. For example, a culture where employees are enthused and encouraged to identify wildfire risks and raise them to management, and where management properly responds to employee inputs and incorporates them into planning and decision-making for effective wildfire mitigation. Wildfire mitigation, on the other hand, requires rigorous asset risk analysis to identify key risk and drivers, select effective mitigations, and prioritize deployment of these mitigations by locations or assets. We urge the Wildfire Safety Division to recognize the differences between safety culture and wildfire mitigation plans, and not conflate these for organizational accountability and responsibility or metrics. Southern California Edison uses a 25-dimension safety culture maturity model that evaluates safety environment within the company, safety practices, personal accountability, and leadership. We measure our progress through safety culture assessments. We currently conduct triennial safety culture assessments administered by a third party, along with twice-a-year pulse surveys to measure safety culture. We also work with our local IBW 47 members to identify opportunities to improve our culture. Our triennial assessment includes a company-wide survey, focus groups, interviews, and observations. Southern California Edison notes that many of the safety culture survey questions in Wildfire Safety Division's proposal are already included in the safety culture assessment surveys we perform. Other utilities have similar surveys as well. Therefore, a targeted wildfire-focused survey is not necessary. We contend that there is no wildfire safety culture that is separate and distinct from our overarching safety culture. Separate from safety culture surveys, wildfire mitigation, capability, and progress has to be measured by a different set of metrics. First and foremost, it is critical to effectively execute our approved wildfire mitigation plan. Metrics such as the scope of work completed and how it compares with wildfire mitigation plans are good metrics to track to help ensure focus on wildfire safety. The effectiveness of the wildfire mitigation plans can be measured using metrics such as reduction in number of faults, tree-caused circuit interruptions, inspection findings, ignitions, etc. It should be noted, however, that metrics that are largely outside the utility's control may be good metrics to measure the status of wildfire safety in California, but not to measure utilities' wildfire mitigation effectiveness. In addition, no one metric can be used to determine effectiveness of wildfire mitigation activities, as these metrics are susceptible to exogenous factors such as weather, fire suppression, and fire response that need to be normalized. Therefore, progress should be measured by looking across metrics and trends over time. In conclusion, Southern California Edison and the other IOUs will provide more detail and specific recommendations in written comments later this month. We do look forward to continued engagement and collaboration with the Wildfire Safety Division and the key stakeholders in the coming months. That concludes my comments. I do have Bill Chu from our transmission and distribution organization here on the wildfire team specifically that can help me answer any questions that the commissioner panelists might have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew, very much. I do have a question. I guess I just don't understand your objection to things you're already doing, right? The legislature has said that there should be a safety committee. Edison's board of directors already has a safety committee. From what I'm hearing you say, they already are charged with kind of being responsible at the board level for the wildfire mitigation policies and the public safety power shutoffs policies. So why is that a problem? To just show us that we have a committee and this is their mission and it includes those things.
So if you're referring to specific things that are already covered in Assembly Bill 1054, we think we're meeting that requirement already and reporting to the to the state on a regular basis. So we're not objecting to that. We're just saying that prescriptive direction should not be coming from this area, that we're already meeting those requirements.
Okay, but all we're asking for is a showing in that case.
Yeah, so again.
Okay. All right, so secondarily, the expertise of the members of the board of directors and or the board of the safety committee. You know, our recommendation is actually fairly middle ground. The Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, in their report, is recommending that we actually draw up the job descriptions, right? So, okay, why shouldn't there be an expectation for safety experience that is pertinent to wildfire safety?
So I think what you're asking is about the prescriptive direction that we're trying to be provided upon the utilities, right? So I think that gets to the, some of the comments about removing that flexibility for us to make those decisions. If you're specifically referring to the qualifications for like board members, as we pointed out, that's a very, very, very narrow window of personnel that we have, may be very difficult to find, and that will help balance the other risk associated with the work we do as a utility.
Okay, and then thirdly, we had PG&E actually hire two people. One is the chief risk officer and one is the chief safety officer. What's wrong with having a chief safety officer that is also involved in the wildfire mitigation? I note that, this is electrical operations, but safety has become the really important part of it. So what if we just said a chief safety officer or equivalent at senior vice president level that has this as part of their responsibility?
So we have my responsibility responsible for the safety of all of our employees, including our contract workforce and the public. Those efforts have been ongoing well before the wildfire issue became as emergent as it has. As we stated in the comments, the Wildfire Mitigation Plan and execution is really about asset management and strategy there. So we do have electrical engineering type of expertise that resides in an organization that is taking care of that part of the business. It is not separate. It is definitely related, and I am involved. Part of my responsibility for our business resiliency organization is the public safety power shutoff, the incident management teams that we set up. We qualify them. So we have, in a sense, the same equivalent of senior vice president, in our case in T&D, Phil Harrington, who is responsible for the wildfire mitigation.
Okay, again, I'm having difficulty. If you're already doing it, why is it a problem showing us that you're doing it? But let's leave that. And then with regard to metrics, the bullet points of metrics that are in the staff proposal, those are directly drawn from the examples that Southern California Edison gave us in our interview as to what appropriate metrics might be. Do you have a problem with things like ignition trends, wires down, faults, near misses, inspection findings, customer outages from PSPS, injuries, fatalities, and acres burned as a way for us to determine whether your safety culture, and in particular your culture regarding safety and wildfire issues, is working? And if not, what else should we be looking at?
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Chu right now, who's specifically driving the efforts associated with the wildfire mitigation plan.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi, Andrew. Hope everybody and Arthur, hope you could hear me. So maybe just to add a little bit to that, we're not objecting to the metrics that's laid out, but I do wanted to point out that a lot of these metrics are influenced, as Andrew had described, by exogenous factors. And it's important to consider these as sort of a trend over a longer period of time, not as a single specific data point. Specifically to some of the metrics, for example, in terms of acre burns, we do have a concern about using that particular one, for example, because that really speaks to the fire response and suppression that's really largely outside of the control of the utility. But some of the earlier metrics that's listed, ignitions, for example, wire downs, for example, those are definitely ones that those are the ones that we have recommended, and we do strongly believe that over time, they'll be the right metrics to measure how successful we are in mitigating the wildfire risk. ultimately, we like to think of the safety culture being distinct, separate from the wildfire mitigation metrics, if you will. Think of the safety culture as an enabler, but they're not the same.
Okay, we'll look forward to your comments on that. And then just back to Andrew, the question, you say that the SCE is already doing triennial, essentially kind of assessments, and then pulse on a regular basis every 2 years. Can you share that information with the Commission? Is there any hindrance to doing that that might save us from having to create a targeted questionnaire as long as the right questions are being asked?
Yeah, so to answer your question directly, we can share. We're willing to share and discuss that. And just for clarification, the triannual safety culture assessment company-wide that's performed is supplemented by the pulse surveys, which we are doing. We did this year. We'll perform 2 a year, so they are 2 a year or more.
Okay. All right. I'm willing to turn it open to questions from the audience. I will just remind everybody that what we're talking about now is a process. And what we can do, given our resource constraints and given the amount of time and given the fact that we have to assess 8 different utilities on an annual basis to do this. So, we're looking for the most practical approaches. One thing that kind of stands out to me is that, we have to have some level of minimal showing, right? And that's why I identified things in safety governance as things that you're already doing and you can show us. We have to be able to get a self-assessment and to be able to verify that self-assessment somehow, right? So that's really kind of like where these kind of like management questions or employee surveys come from. And we have to have metrics that really show us results, right? And what we're trying to do is leverage the metrics that we're already collecting that are particularly appropriate for this. So if everybody can keep that in mind, it might help us to be able to focus how we revise this proposal and what you'll finally see. And then the final thing is that these are not new requirements from the Commission. These are expectations in order for you to get your safety certificate. Okay? Some utilities are not applying for safety certificates, so they're not going to be involved in this. I think it's a question of what the utility is willing to do, and if our assessment makes recommendations, are you going to be in good standing by agreeing to those recommendations, because that's what's written in the statute. So, that's where we're at on this. We have to keep both a practical and a firmly established policy foundation for what we do going forward, and I look forward to anybody's recommendations on how to do that better. Lola, if you can look at the chat and see if there's some specific questions, and we'll take them. We have half an hour. Are you on mute? I'm not here, and unfortunately, I can't see the chat.
Hey, Arthur, it's Ryan here.
Oh, here you go.
I saw one question come in via the chat earlier, and it's a fairly lengthy one, so I will read it out loud, and then we can go back to it if needed.
Okay.
So this is coming from Henry Burton at the Public Advocate's Office. Why do you say that each utility should employ a chief safety officer? Why wouldn't that be part of a CEO's job? There are 2 ways of thinking about safety in an organization. A, it's a specific activity that can be assigned to one organization or chain of command, or B, it's how you approach your work, meaning that it's something that permeates the entire organization and cannot be assigned to one person or chain of command.
Okay. I cannot really answer that question for our panelists. I will say that in the PG&E case, it was determined that there really needed to be a clear line of authority along this regard, and that the chief safety officer needed to have clear access both to the top executives, right, CEO, and also to the board of directors, and that's what we were following on that. So, Andrew, what do you think?
I think definitely, there has to be enough organizational authority and accountability so that we can influence and enable outcomes, and that's not specific or unique to wildfire mitigation. It could be hydroelectric dams, electrical safety, other public safety interfaces we have. So, but I do agree on the premise that the safety individual should not be responsible in driving activities or setting strategies going forward on those bases. So, in which we're trying to do, right? We're trying to improve at Edison. We're trying to improve our culture and enable and enhance so that all activities perform at higher levels, whether it's the safety of our employees, our contractors, or the public.
Okay, Angela, in the time that North Star has been following PG&E, I think they've had 5 chief safety officers or the equivalent. Is that the effective place? I mean, is that where this responsibility ought to reside? And also kind of like to make the distinction between all the other safety issues, health and safety, as you pointed out.
Well, I think that the concept that safety should permeate the organization and that everybody is responsible for safety is accurate. In PG&E's case, after San Bruno, they were largely reacting and did not have a coherent approach to how to address some of the issues that they were having. And I would say they're still in some ways struggling with that, but they have had a lot of turnover in the chief safety officer position. That position was elevated recently as a result of the reorganization, and that may create some stability. But at the time that we initially recommended the need for the chief safety officer, the safety function had been buried so far down in the organization that it was not sending the right message.
So really the issue is that there's somebody, that everybody is responsible for safety, but there's somebody who has to be answerable. Right? Somebody has to be accountable. Yes, I agree the chief executive officer ought to be accountable, and I think the commission has certainly made that clear. The board of directors needs to be answerable and accountable, and I think the commission has made that clear. I think that what we're focusing on is who gets the questions, right? Who responds to kind of like our queries and our concerns. So, kind of like if you have suggestions as to what that should be, then we would accept them in the comments. Okay. Anything else, Ryan?
No, that's it from the chat box.
Well, gee, we'll give everybody an opportunity. To our 2 panelists, right? Did you hear something that the other person said that you'd like to respond to? Angela?
Yeah, I would agree that placing culture in the safety certification process is challenging and maybe not the best place for it, but it is basically the hand that you were dealt.
As so often happens with the legislature. Andrew?
Yeah, the distinction, recognizing that PG&E is a very challenging situation. They're getting help from North Star, which, we've been watching very closely, obviously. But I think that's a different situation than we're in now, and I think you need to have different, sets of approaches depending on your situation. So, again, just remind us, we're very supportive of the efforts here to have a strong safety culture that helps mitigate wildfire risk and other public safety impacts, but we want to not conflate the specific things that we talked about, such as metrics. And we are looking forward to discussions and recognizing there is a short timeline by the end of the year, and I think we can get to a common ground.
Arthur, it looks like you may be muted.
Hearing no other questions from the floor.
No questions.
We do.
Yeah, is there?
We had 2 more just come in.
Great.
Sounds like Lola, perhaps.
Fire away. I heard voices and now I'm not hearing voices.
Hey, it's Ryan. I'll go ahead and I'll read the first one, and this is from William Abrams. How will the scalability of these safety culture assessment tools be considered for a particular utility? Will low survey scores in a particular category perhaps lead to a focus group that dives deeper into the safety, quote, area of concern, end quote?
I think I heard that as a suggestion from Angela, that we use the responses from surveys to target and go deeper. How exactly that works out given time constraints and resource constraints, I cannot say right now, but it is a consideration. Anybody have any ideas? No, we'll take that into consideration then. Something else, Ryan?
Yep, there's one more question, again from William Abrams. How will the learnings from the PG&E Safety Culture OII being applied, how are the learnings from the PG&E Safety Culture OII being applied to this effort? There was extensive work and input from independent SMEs into how to tie safety culture to incentives, metrics to leverage, etc. Will this build off that effort?
Well, I think that is really an issue for the bigger safety culture assessments, right? Rather than our charge. We're not inventing new processes. We're not redefining safety culture. We're really just trying to get a sense of how we can get a documentation of assessment of what the utilities are doing and how they're improving over time. There is an ongoing proceeding in which those kinds of issues are being raised, and certainly it's open in the PG&E safety culture investigation for development of ideas that have not been dealt with. I think that from my point of view, right, and I'm just a staffer, that the whole PG&E issue got sidetracked because of the bankruptcy and because of the severity of the incidents that occurred after we began the investigation. And so it raised a lot of issues that are really, as SCE points out, really not necessarily pertinent to the other utilities. And we want to separate those out. We want to get fundamental issues that really help guide safety culture as it filters down into wildfire safety practices, without getting involved in should PG&E be broken up and how do we measure kind of the effectiveness of all that stuff. That's really, we don't have the ability to do that, and we don't have a process to do that. Our process is pretty much talk to people, get comments, put out a resolution, right? And all of those things that you raised in your question are kind of beyond our capability, but they do belong in commission proceedings and especially in rulemakings. So that's where that stuff should be developed.
And maybe, Arthur, if I could switch my hat quickly, what I could say from a WSD standpoint is if there are specifics that are being offered or that could be identified, I think those would be helpful in the comments for us to have as a reference point.
Yeah, of course. Okay, you want to take us home, Ryan?
Sure. So again, thank you to everybody who attended today's workshop. In particular, thanks to Arthur and Coco for their presentations today. Our respondents who also helped build a broad discussion for us today. And of course, just yet, we'll remind you again, we are looking for written comments by August 26th. We have a 20-page limit, and we're asking you to email those comments to Wildfire Safety Division at cpuc.ca.gov and to the service list 1810007. And further dates going out, of course, with the final being our statutory deadline for the Commission to consider the WMP guidelines as well as the safety culture assessment process. Today is December 1st, so we're working within that time frame. And
also, I think I got a question about, are there going to be other workshops or other issues? I know that we still have the issues of executive compensation that goes into the safety certification to deal with, and some residual things. Can we start planning another workshop? I'm not looking for work, but go ahead.
That's not there yet. But yeah, we certainly know that's an important topic, and we're doing what we can to make sure that we're addressing that.
Okay, great.
Nice.
With that, thank you all. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to your comments, and know that we take them very seriously, and we'll try and come up with the best proposals that we can. And then you get to comment on those when the resolution comes out.